He spent his last penny on a mail-in bride, and the whole town stood watching as the carriage door opened. No one said a word. Then the laughter began. The girl stepped out, heavy, her legs trembling, barely able to stand on the ground, and people called him a fool. They said to get rid of her. They said he had ruined himself. But Coulter Ashby saw what the town didn't see, and that decision would change everything. Press like, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come, and stay until the end, because this is just the beginning. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave the people of Harlan's Crossing plenty of time to gather. They came the way people in small towns always come to spectacles, pretending they had other business there. Agnes Pruitt positioned herself near the dry goods store with a basket over her arm like she'd planned to buy flour all along. Walt Deering leaned against the post outside the feed barn and whittled at a stick he'd been working down to nothing for 3 weeks. The Caldwell boys perched on the fence rail by the water trough and elbowed each other and didn't bother pretending at all. Coulter Ashby stood alone at the edge of the road. He'd put on his better shirt, the dark one without the frayed cuffs, and he'd shaved that morning, nicking himself twice under the jaw. He could feel the dried blood tightening against his skin in the heat. He kept his hat in his hands because it felt wrong to wear it, like waiting at a church, though he hadn't been inside one of those in years. The truth was, he didn't know what he was waiting for exactly. He'd sent the letter 7 months ago through the Continental Placement Agency out of St. Louis. He'd paid $38 for the correspondence service and another $12 for the travel voucher, and he'd filled out the form the way you fill out any form. Honestly, mostly, with a few things left vague because the truth didn't always recommend itself. He'd written that he had a working ranch of 300 acres in the Utah Territory. He hadn't mentioned that the well had gone shallow in June. He'd written that he was looking for a capable partner, someone willing to work alongside him in building something lasting. He hadn't mentioned that 3 neighboring ranches had already been bought out and that his own banknote was due in October. He'd written that he was patient and fair-minded. That part was true. The letter he'd received in return was from a woman named Eleanor Voss, 24 years old, from a town in Pennsylvania. She described herself as plain-spoken, unafraid of hard work, accustomed to difficult conditions. She'd said she was healthy. She'd asked very few questions about him and focused most of her letter on what she could contribute. She could preserve food. She could manage accounts. She'd helped run her father's boarding house for 6 years. Her handwriting was clean and even, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who thinks before they put the pen down. He'd written back. They'd exchanged 4 more letters over the following months. He'd asked her once why she wanted to come west, and she'd said, "Because staying where I am is no longer a choice I'm willing to make." He'd read that sentence several times and understood it in a way he couldn't quite put words to. He'd sent the travel voucher in February. She was supposed to arrive in March. It was now the first week of April, and this was the 3rd stagecoach he'd come to meet. The coach came in from the south, throwing dust, the driver calling out to slow the team before they'd fully rounded the bend. Coulter settled his hat back on his head and moved toward the road. Around him, the gathered townspeople adjusted their positions. Nobody moved too close. They just shifted, like livestock turning into a wind, so that everyone had a clear line of sight. The driver climbed down and stretched his back and didn't look at anyone in particular. His assistant, a young man with a sunburned neck, went around to the boot and began pulling down the luggage. There were 2 other passengers, a traveling merchant and an older woman in a gray dress, who climbed out first and moved away quickly, the way people do when they sense they're about to be part of something they'd rather not witness. Then the door stayed open. A long moment passed. The assistant glanced at the driver. The driver looked at the ground. Then a hand appeared, gripping the door frame, a wide hand, the knuckles pale with effort. And Eleanor Voss stepped out of the stagecoach. Coulter had been standing about 15 feet away. Later, he would not remember deciding to stop walking. He just did. She was not what he'd pictured. He hadn't let himself picture much, honestly. That way led to disappointment. But the woman lowering herself down from the coach step was large in a way that went beyond size. Her dress, which might once have fit her properly, strained across her shoulders and back. Her face was round and flushed from the journey and damp with the kind of sweat that doesn't come from heat alone. Her ankles, visible as she reached for the ground, were swollen above her boots. But it was the way she moved that stopped him. She wasn't moving like someone who was heavy. She was moving like someone who was hurt. There was something wrong with her legs. Not a limp exactly, more like a careful negotiation with each step, like she was calculating every time she put weight down. She gripped the door frame until she was on solid ground, then she stood for a moment with her eyes closed, breathing. Around Coulter, the silence cracked open. Walt Deering let out a sound, not quite a laugh, something lower and meaner than that. One of the Caldwell boys said something to his brother that Coulter couldn't hear, but he could hear the other one's response, which was, "Lord Almighty." Agnes Pruitt pressed her lips together and turned away, which was its own kind of comment. Nell Voss opened her eyes. She looked directly at Coulter. She must have known, from the way he was standing, who he was. And she held his gaze with an expression that was not apologetic and was not defiant. It was something harder to read than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had expected this and had decided in advance what to do with it. She picked up the small bag at her feet. The assistant hadn't offered to help, and she hadn't asked. And she walked toward him. Her walk was slow. The ground wasn't even, and every uneven patch cost her something. He could see it in her jaw. But she walked. When she was 5 feet away, she stopped and said in a clear voice, "Mr. Ashby, I'm Nell Voss. I'm sorry I'm late. The first coach had a broken axle, and I had to wait 3 days for the next one." He said, "That's all right." And then, because he couldn't think of anything better, "Did you eat on the road?" Something moved behind her eyes. "Not much. It's a long journey." "We can fix that," he said. But he'd brought his wagon, expecting to load it with her luggage. There wasn't much. The small bag she'd carried herself and a trunk that the assistant finally brought around, grudgingly, with the air of someone performing a favor they'd decided to resent. Coulter loaded both without comment. He was helping her up onto the wagon seat. She needed his arm, and took it without making anything of it, when Hector Pruitt stepped out from the gathered crowd. Hector was Agnes's husband, a big man who'd been a mining foreman before he'd come to the territory, and who'd never quite lost the habit of speaking to people like they were workers he'd hired. "Ashby," he said. A word. Coulter settled Nell on the seat and turned around. "Go ahead." Hector glanced at Nell, and then back at Coulter in a way that was meant to be private, except that there were 20 people standing within earshot. "You been had, son. That agency took your money and sent you damaged goods. There's no shame in it. Those outfits run that kind of scheme all the time. Send her back and file a complaint. You might get half your fee returned." "She's not goods," Coulter said. "You know what I mean." "I do," Coulter said. "That's the problem." Hector looked at him like he was being slow on purpose. "You can't work a ranch with that. You need someone who can pull weight, Coulter, not someone who's going to take up resources you don't have. You're barely keeping that place going as it is. Everyone knows it." "Then everyone knows I don't have time to stand here." Coulter turned to the wagon. "She'll drag you under," Hector said, louder now, meaning it for the crowd as much as for him. "Mark it." Coulter climbed up onto the wagon seat. He picked up the reins. He was aware of Nell sitting very still beside him, looking straight ahead, and he was aware of what it cost to sit like that with 20 people staring and a man 10 feet away saying what Hector Pruitt had just said. He clicked the horses forward. They were half a mile out of town before either of them spoke. "You didn't have to do that," Nell said. "Do what?" "Argue with him on my account. I've heard worse. I'm not going to fall apart." "I wasn't doing it on your account," Coulter said. "I was doing it on mine. I don't like being told what to do with my own property." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her deciding something. "He wasn't entirely wrong, though," she said. "I'm not what you ordered." "No." "You can say what you actually think, Mr. Ashby. I'd rather know now than later." He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who talked around things when he could say them straight, but he also knew that some things said straight landed like a fist when you meant them to land like a hand. "I think you look like someone who's been through something bad," he said finally. "And I think you came out the other side of it and got on 3 different stagecoaches and made it here anyway. I think I'll wait and see what that's worth before I make any decisions." The road ran through dry scrub and red rock on either side, the late afternoon light flattening everything golden. A hawk was circling something out to the east. "I was heavier," Nell said after a while. "Before I came west, I've lost weight since February, which sounds like it ought to be good, but it wasn't. It wasn't the healthy kind of losing. I didn't have much to eat for a while. I'm weaker than I should be. I figured something like that. I'll tell you everything when I'm ready. Not today. That's fine. But I want you to know, she said, that I'm not a burden. I mean to be a partner, like I said in my letters. I just might need some time before I can show you that. All right, he said. You believe me? He thought about the handwriting, the sentence about staying where she was no longer being a choice she was willing to make. I'm inclined to, he said. Bashat. The ranch was worse than he'd described in the letters. She could tell he knew she could tell, from the way he stopped talking when they came up the rise and the buildings came into view. The main house was solid enough, 2 rooms, low ceilings, chinked log walls, but the barn needed a new roof on the south end, and the fence line along the eastern pasture had been patched so many times with different materials that it looked like a quilt. The garden plot was barely breaking ground, late in the season and thin. The livestock she could see. 4 cattle, a dozen chickens, 2 horses including the pair in harness, all looked like they'd had a hard winter. It's bigger in the spring, he said, which was clearly not what he'd meant to say. It's a working ranch, she said. I've seen worse. She hadn't, quite, but she had the sense that what he needed from her in this moment was not pity. He helped her down from the wagon. Her legs had stiffened on the ride out and the step down made her breath catch, though she kept it quiet. He noticed anyway. She could tell from the way he slowed his own movement to give her more time, but he didn't comment on it, which she appreciated more than she could have said. There was a man working at the fence near the gate, a lean Mexican man in his 40s who straightened up when the wagon came in and took his hat off. This is Aurelio, Coulter said. He runs the livestock. Aurelio, this is Miss Voss. She'll be staying on. Aurelio nodded at her with a gravity that was respectful without being stiff. Señorita, welcome. Thank you, she said. Are those your repair patches on the east fence? He looked surprised. See, 3 times since winter. The second patch from the north, the wire's looped over itself. It'll fail in the first hard wind. I saw it coming up the road. He glanced at Coulter, who had an expression she couldn't read. Then he looked back at her. I'll fix it tonight. Thank you, she said again, and let Coulter lead her toward the house. Inside was a single main room with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of mismatched supplies, and a door leading to what she assumed was the sleeping room. It was clean enough, in the way of a man living alone. Not dirty, just stripped down, no extra anything. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the shelves. After a moment she said, Your cornmeal is stored next to your salt pork. That's where it fits. The salt pork sweats in summer. It'll draw moisture into the cornmeal, and you'll lose half of it to mold by July. She moved to the shelves and studied them without touching anything. You've got enough flour to last 6 weeks if you're careful, but the weevil sign on that lower bag means you probably have 4. Your dried beans are fine. Your salt supply is good. Your lamp oil is low and your soap is almost out. She turned around. Who's been keeping your accounts? I keep them in my head. That's not keeping them. She said it without accusation, just as a fact. Do you have paper? I'd like to start writing things down. He stared at her for a moment. She wondered if she'd gone too far. Too soon, too much. Walking into a man's house and cataloging its failures before she'd even taken off her coat. But then something shifted in his face, something she hadn't seen there before. There's a ledger in the box under the table, he said. She slept in the main room that first night on the narrow cot he'd set up near the stove, because her legs wouldn't have managed the sleeping room floor without help, and she wasn't ready for that kind of help from anyone yet. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the territory. The wind moving through the scrub, something calling far out in the dark, the creak of the house settling, and she let herself feel, for the first time in a long time, that she was somewhere she might be able to stay. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more careful than that. She'd had plenty of time, on the 3 stagecoaches and the 2 waiting periods in between, to think about what she was riding toward. She knew what she looked like. She'd known for years what she looked like. In the way you know a thing that's been told to you so many times, it stops feeling like information and starts feeling like weather, just a condition you live inside. Her mother had been practical about it. Her father hadn't mentioned it because he didn't mention much of anything. The men who'd come to the boarding house over the years had mentioned it plenty. She'd spent the last 8 months in a cousin's house in Pittsburgh, in a situation that had started as charity and ended as something considerably less charitable. And by January, she'd been 3 months behind on her meals and sleeping in the storage room. When she'd found the advertisement for the placement agency in the back of a newspaper someone had left in the kitchen, she'd filled out the form before she'd finished reading it. She hadn't lied exactly. She'd described herself as plain-spoken and hard-working, which was true. She'd said she was healthy, which had been true when she'd written it, and was less true now. She'd said she was accustomed to difficult conditions, which was the truest thing she'd ever written about herself. She hadn't described her body. The form hadn't asked. In the dark of Coulter Ashby's main room, she pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and thought about the look on his face when she'd stepped off the stagecoach. She'd been watching for it, braced for it, had run through every possible version of it during the last 2 days on the road. Disgust, pity, anger at having been deceived. What she'd seen instead was something she hadn't prepared for. He'd looked like a man doing arithmetic, like he was running calculations and hadn't reached a conclusion yet. That was all. And then he'd asked if she'd eaten. She turned onto her side, careful of her ankles, and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub. Something clicked in the stove. She heard him shift in the next room, one creak of the floor, and then silence. "I'll wait and see what that's worth," he'd said. She decided, in the dark, that she would show him. Morning came before she was ready for it, the way mornings on the frontier apparently came. Hard and immediate, no easing in. She heard Coulter up before dawn, the stove being loaded, and she got herself sitting before he came through the door so he wouldn't find her struggling to rise. "You don't have to be up," he said. "I'm up," she said. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without being asked. It was very strong and very hot, and she held it in both hands and felt it moving through her. They ate breakfast without much conversation. He wasn't a morning talker, which suited her fine. And then he laid out the day's work. The south fence needed repair. He had a sick calf he was watching. The garden needed water if the well held. He had to ride out to check on the upper pasture. "What can you do?" he asked, not unkindly. Just practical. She thought about it honestly. Standing for long periods was still a problem. Lifting anything heavy was out of the question for now. Walking the fence line would take her half a day instead of an hour. She couldn't be of any physical use in the way he needed, not yet, and she knew it. "Let me see the supply ledger and your accounts from the last 6 months," she said, "and let me look at your root cellar and your smokehouse. I want to understand what you actually have before I tell you what I can do." He looked like he wanted to say something about the fence, or the calf, or the dozen things requiring arms and legs today. "All right," he said instead. The root cellar was bad. Not catastrophic, but bad in the way that small, ignored problems become bad. A slow accumulation of losses. He'd put up good stores in the fall. She could see the evidence of that. But the winter had been harder than he'd planned for, and the spring had been dry, and he'd been drawing down on reserves without tracking the rate. At the current pace, she calculated, they would run short on preserved meat by early summer and short on grain by August. She stood in the cool dark of the cellar with the ledger he'd given her and wrote down every number she could see. When she came back up into the light, Aurelio was at the fence and Coulter was at the barn. She went to the garden. Her legs ached. The sun was already hard. She knelt in the dirt beside the planted rows and looked at the seedlings, which were sparse and unevenly spaced, and she thought about every winter she'd spent in the storage room in Pittsburgh, planning, because planning was the only thing she'd had. She'd been planning for months. She had ideas, not soft ideas, but real, specific, practical things, and she had the knowledge to back them up. What she didn't have yet was the strength to do most of them herself. "That's all right," she thought, pressing her thumb into the dry soil. "You don't always need your body. Sometimes you need your head." She started with the seeds she could reach from the ground. 3 days passed in that way, each day a careful inventory of what she could do and what she couldn't yet. Each evening a ledger entry that told a story Coulter hadn't known he was living. On the 4th day, he came in from the fields and found her at the table with papers spread in front of her and a look on her face that he'd started to recognize. The look of someone about to say something he wouldn't want to hear. Your banknote is due in October, she said. I know that. At the current yield rate for your cattle, you'll be about $40 short. I know that too. But if you sell the South 40 acres to the Mendez family, I heard Aurelio mention they've been wanting to expand their goat herd and that land's not good for cattle grazing anyway, you'd cover the note and have $12 left over. He was quiet. I know it's not what you want, she said. It's your land, but it's better than losing the whole note and having the bank decide for you. Who said I want your opinion on my banknote? The words came out harder than he'd meant them to. He knew that even as he said it. It was a long day and the calf had gotten worse, and the well was dropping another inch a week and he was tired. She looked at him for a moment without changing her expression. You're right, she said. I overstepped. I'm sorry. No, He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair. No, you're right. About the land. He sat down across from her. It just sounds different when someone else says it. I know, she said. Not sympathetically, just honestly. He looked at the papers spread between them. Numbers, columns, notations in her clean, even handwriting. He'd lived in this place for 4 years, and he hadn't known half of what these papers were telling him. How do you know all this? He said. My father's boarding house, she said. 6 years of keeping accounts while he drank away the profit. I got good at arithmetic because someone had to. She paused. I'm not trying to take over your ranch, Mr. Ashby. I'm trying to help you keep it. He looked at her across the papers. Coulter, he said. Pardon? Call me Coulter. Mr. Ashby is my father. Something moved through her face, but not quite a smile, but the shape of one. All right, she said. Coulter. And then, there's one more thing. Of course there is. Your neighbors, she said. The ones to the north. I saw the fence line when we came in. They've been moving your markers. He went very still. How do you know that? Because the rock configuration on your land survey, I found your survey in the box with the ledger, doesn't match where the current fence posts are sitting. Someone moved them, probably in winter when the ground was soft and no one was watching. Outside, the wind was coming up from the south, the dry, hot wind that meant no rain, and Coulter Ashby sat at his table looking at the woman he'd been told to send away, and thought about all the things a man didn't know he didn't know. Who else has seen this? He said. Just me, she said. And Aurelio, but I asked him not to say anything yet. Why? Because if we go to the land office now with nothing but a survey and a complaint, they'll dismiss it. But if we document it first, dates, measurements, witnesses, we have something that holds up. She met his eyes. I've done this before, or something like it. I know what it takes to get someone in power to actually listen to people like us. People like us. He noticed she'd said it that way. Not people like you, not people like me. Us. It was the first time in 4 days that the word had sat between them without feeling strange. All right, he said after a moment. We document it. She nodded and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Outside, the wind was picking up, moving through the dry scrub like it meant business. And somewhere in the upper pasture, one of the cattle was calling for something it couldn't find. And the territory was as hard and indifferent as it had always been. But in the small house, on the small ranch on the edge of things, a lamp burned over a table where 2 people bent over a page together, and for the first time in longer than either of them could have easily said, neither one of them was entirely alone. By the end of the second week, the talk in Harlan's Crossing had changed shape. It was still mostly unkind. Walt Deering had told a version of the stagecoach arrival at least a dozen times, each telling adding small embellishments. In the latest version, the coach had had to be reinforced to carry her, which was not true, but it got a laugh every time, and Walt Deering lived for laughs. Agnes Pruitt had said, with the precision of someone delivering a medical opinion, that it would end badly, that Coulter Ashby had made a sentimental decision and would pay for it with his land. Hector had not said anything further to Coulter directly, but the silence he offered when they passed on the road was its own kind of statement. The Caldwell boys had ridden out past the ranch twice in 1 week, slowly, looking at things. Coulter had seen them from the upper pasture the second time and watched them until they moved on, not liking the way they sat their horses and not liking the way they looked at the fence line. He hadn't said anything to Nell about the Caldwells. She had enough on her mind. What he hadn't said to anyone, including himself, was that the ranch felt different than it had in years. The accounts were clear for the first time since the banknote had been written. The root cellar had been reorganized in a way that might get them through summer without a serious shortage. The fence post measurements were written in a notebook that Nell kept with her at the table each evening, and the survey was pinned to the wall, and for the first time he had the sense of being someone who knew what he had, which was a different feeling than he'd expected. He'd talked to Diego Mendez about the South 40. Diego had been cautiously interested. They'd shaken hands on a price, pending the formal paperwork. It wasn't a loss, exactly. It was a decision. Nell had called it that, and he'd started thinking about it that way. On the 14th evening, she cooked dinner for the first time. She'd asked him that morning if she could, not the way you ask permission, but the way you ask someone if they have objections, which was a distinction he was beginning to understand about her. He'd said he didn't have objections. When he came in from the field, she had something on the stove that smelled better than anything that had come out of that stove in 4 years, which was not difficult because most of what had come out of it was beans, but still. It was a stew made from the dried venison and some root vegetables from the cellar, and something she'd done with the wild onions that grew along the creek bank that he hadn't known were edible. She'd had to sit down 3 times while making it. He could tell from how she was sitting when he came in, the careful way she settled herself that said her legs were bothering her. But the stew was done, and the table was set with 2 tin plates, and she looked up when he came through the door without any expression that asked for comment on any of it. "Sit down," she said. "It's hot." He sat down. He ate. The stew was good. Genuinely good, not polite good. And he said so because she'd said she wanted him to say what he actually thought. "The wild onions were your Aurelio's idea," she said. "He knew they were there. I just didn't know you could use them this way until he told me." He noticed she'd called him your Aurelio, like he was something Coulter owned, and he noticed she'd given credit for the idea to Aurelio without being asked, and he filed both observations away without knowing quite what to do with them yet. They ate mostly in silence, which was becoming comfortable in the way a worn boot becomes comfortable, without you quite noticing when it stopped rubbing. After a while she said, "Hector Pruitt came by today." He set his fork down. "What did he want?" "He says there's a man out of Salt Lake named Garland who's been buying up land in the valley. He says Garland's agents have made offers to 3 families in the last month, all low offers, all declined so far." She looked at her plate. "He came here, I think, to tell you to sell before you can't. He wasn't unkind about it. He just thought you should know." "Was he right? About the offers?" "I don't know yet, but I think we need to find out." She looked up. "Aurelio has a cousin who works at the land registry office in the county seat. I'd like to ask him to reach out." Coulter looked at her across the table. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been careful," she said. It was not the same thing, and they both knew it. Outside, the last light was leaving the sky in long red streaks, and the territory was going dark the way it did, all at once, like a lamp being turned down. And somewhere in the direction of the Caldwell property, something was moving in the dark that had no good reason to be moving. But inside, the lamp was burning, and the stove was warm, and 2 people who had no particular reason to trust each other were beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to do exactly that. Aurelio's cousin was named Tomas, and he worked 3 days a week at the county land registry office in Mill Haven, 40 miles southeast of Harlan's Crossing, filing deeds and copying surveys for a salary that barely covered his rent. He was a quiet man, careful with his words, the way people become careful when they've learned that saying the wrong thing in the wrong room has consequences. Aurelio had described him as honest, which in Aurelio's vocabulary was the highest compliment available. He sent a letter on a Tuesday. The reply came back the following Thursday, and Aurelio brought it to the house without opening it, which Coulter noted and appreciated. Nell read it at the table while Coulter stood by the stove with his coffee going cold in his hand. She read it twice. Then she set it down and smoothed it flat with her palm, which was something she did when she was thinking and didn't want anyone to know how hard she was thinking. 3 properties, she said, transferred in the last 8 months. The Haverford Place, the old Sutter claim on the Eastern Ridge, and the Brennan homestead. "Brennan sold out," Coulter said. "In February. He said he got a fair price." "Tomas doesn't think it was fair. He says the assessments on all 3 parcels were filed at roughly 40% below the actual land value. She looked up. And all 3 transfers went to the same holding company, Cascade Land and Cattle, out of Salt Lake City. I've heard that name. Hector Pruitt mentioned it to me when he came by. He said Garland runs it. She looked back at the letter. But Tomas says the registered agent for Cascade isn't Garland. It's a lawyer named Fitch, Marcus Fitch, with an office in the county seat. What's Garland's connection? Not documented. That's the point. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. Whoever is doing this is doing it in a way that keeps the real buyer's name off the paper. Coulter set his coffee down. That's not illegal. No, she said. It's not. But it suggests they're worried about what happens if people know who's buying, and that suggests there are people who would object if they knew. She looked at him steadily. People like you. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The morning sun was coming through the window at a low angle, laying a stripe of light across the table between them, and outside he could hear Aurelio working the horses in the near pasture, the familiar sounds of the ranch starting its day. What do you want to do with this? He said. I want to know how many families in the valley are on the list, she said. Not just who's already sold, who they're planning to approach next. She paused. I think it's us. Why? Because we're adjacent to 2 of the 3 parcels already transferred. If someone wanted to consolidate land in this valley for a large cattle operation, which is what Cascade Land appears to be building, our 300 acres sits in the middle of it like a cork in a bottle. She tapped the table with one finger. We're not convenient for them. We're essential. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then they'll come with an offer, he said. They'll come with something, she said. I don't know yet if it'll be an offer. The drought that spring was the worst Coulter could remember, and he'd been on this land for 4 years through 2 dry seasons. The well dropped another 6 inches in May, and by early June it was producing half what it had in April. He rationed water for the livestock first, then the garden, then the house, in that order, because the livestock was income, and the garden was food, and the house was just shelter, and shelter could wait. Nell had reorganized the water storage without being asked. 3 additional barrels she'd found rotting in the back of the equipment shed, which Aurelio had repaired with pine pitch and new stave rings, positioned to catch any rain that came off the roof. It hadn't rained enough to matter, but the barrels were ready when it did, and that was the kind of thinking Coulter had come to rely on without quite admitting it. The cattle were struggling. He'd lost 1 heifer to what the veterinarian in Millhaven, who charged $3 just to make the ride out, called a combination of heat stress and poor forage. The others were thin. The pasture grass was burning off by mid-morning and not recovering. He'd had to let go of the 2 seasonal hands he'd hired in March. He couldn't afford to feed them when he could barely feed the animals. They left without complaint, which was almost worse than if they'd argued. It meant they'd seen it coming and weren't surprised. That left him and Aurelio and Nell, and the ranch was exactly as much work as 3 people could manage if none of them stopped moving from sunup to past dark. Nell's legs were better than they'd been. Not good. She still had hard days when the swelling came back and she moved carefully, measuring each step, but better. She'd put on some weight from eating regularly, not much, but enough to make her face look less drawn and her hands less like they belonged to someone twice her age. She didn't talk about it, and he didn't comment on it, but he'd noticed. What she was good at, he'd learned, was thinking 2 steps ahead of a problem. She'd started keeping a daily log. Weather, water levels, animal conditions, supplies consumed, in a leather-covered book she'd bought at the dry goods store on their 1 trip to town, and she consulted it the way other people consulted instinct. If the well dropped another inch this week, she'd calculated, they needed to reduce the cattle herd by 1 more animal. She'd already identified which one, the older steer whose production value was lowest, and she'd told Coulter so he could arrange a sale in Millhaven before the condition became obvious to the buyers. You can't wait until they're visibly failing, she'd said. Sell before they're desperate, and you control the price. Wait until you're desperate and the buyer does. I know how to sell cattle, he'd said, which was true. Then do it this week, she'd said, which was also true. He'd done it, got a decent price. Came back and told her, and she'd made a note in the ledger without saying anything about being right, which he was beginning to understand was its own form of communication. The trouble with the Caldwells started on a Tuesday in June, which seemed to be a day with a particular talent for bad news. Coulter came back from the upper pasture to find Aurelio standing by the barn with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that means the opposite. "What?" Coulter said. "The south fence," Aurelio said. "The new posts, the ones we set last week." Coulter looked at him. "3 of them pulled up," Aurelio said. "The wire is cut." Coulter stood there for a moment in the heat. A fly was working at a long cut on his forearm from where he'd caught the wire earlier, and he swatted it away automatically, and then he walked to the barn and took his horse back out and rode to the south fence. Aurelio was right. 3 posts, pulled clean from the ground. Not fallen, not rotted, pulled. You could see the drag marks in the dirt, and the wire between them cut in 2 places with something sharp. Clean cuts. Not broken, not worn through. Cut. He stood with his hands on his hips and looked north toward the Caldwell property. The boundary between his land and the Caldwell land had been documented in Nell's notebook. He had measurements, he had dates, he had Aurelio as a witness, and Tomas's letter about the land transfers and a survey map pinned to the wall of the house. What he didn't have was proof of who'd pulled these posts. He rode back to the house and told Nell. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her qualities he'd come to rely on. She never interrupted when someone was telling her something. When he was done, she picked up her notebook and turned to a page near the back. "This is the 3rd incident," she said. "The missing grain sacks in April, the moved survey stakes in May. Now this." She looked at him. "They're testing you." "Testing what?" "How much it takes before you give up." She set the notebook down. "Someone, and I think we both know who, wants you to believe this land is more trouble than it's worth. Every incident is deniable. Grain sacks could have been stolen by anyone, survey stakes move, fence posts can fall." She paused. "But 3 incidents in 60 days isn't coincidence. It's a pattern." "I know that." "Then you know what comes next," she said. "When testing doesn't work, they escalate." He sat down across from her. Through the window, he could see the afternoon heat rising from the dry ground in visible waves. "What do you think we should do?" he said. It was the first time he'd asked her that directly, he realized. Not, "What are you suggesting?" or "What does your ledger say?" but "What do you think we should do?" the way you ask a partner. She noticed it too, he could tell from the slight pause before she answered. "I think we should talk to the other families," she said. "Not just gather information. Actually talk to them, face to face. Find out if they're seeing the same things we are." She looked at him. "If Cascade Land is doing this to us, they're doing it to someone else too. And people who don't know they're not alone tend to give up a lot faster than people who do." "The Pruitts," he said, "and the Mendez family, since we sold them the South 40. And old Harlan Webb, he's got the biggest spread on the north side of the valley." "Start with Webb," she said. "He's been here longest. He'll know what it looked like before, which means he'll know what's changed." "You want to come?" She looked at him. "Do you want me to?" "I asked, didn't I?" She was quiet for a moment, and he got the sense she was deciding whether to say something she'd been keeping to herself. "I'm not easy to travel with," she said finally. "My legs, the heat. It's a hard ride to the Webb place." "I know that." "People will talk." "People are already talking," he said. "I stopped caring about that around day 3. Something moved through her face, that almost smile, and she said, "Then yes, I want to come." Harlan Webb was 71 years old and had been in the Utah Territory since before it had a proper name for itself. He was tall even now, tall and angular, with white hair he kept cut close and hands like saddlery leather. He'd buried 2 wives on his land and raised 3 sons who'd all gone somewhere else, which he spoke of without obvious grief, but with a kind of settled acknowledgement that this was what happened to men who chose land over comfort. He met them at his gate and looked at Nell with a directness that was not unkind, just honest. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. "I'm Nell Ashby," she said. It was the first time Coulter had heard her use the name that way. She'd been Nell Voss in her own references until now, and he kept his face still. Webb looked at her for another moment, then looked at Coulter. "Come in," he said. They sat at Webb's table, which was larger than it needed to be for one man, and drank water from a clay jug because Webb didn't keep coffee in summer. Coulter told him about the fence posts and the survey stakes and the grain. He mentioned Cascade Land and the letter from Tomas. Webb listened the way very old men listen when they've heard versions of this story before. Not patiently, exactly, more like a man watching weather he's already predicted. When Coulter finished, Webb said, "Show me her ledger." Nell passed it across the table without comment. Webb read it. He read it slowly, going back to certain pages, and neither Coulter nor Nell said anything because the man's concentration was obviously total and interrupting it would have been rude. He set it down after about 10 minutes. "This is good work," he said to Nell. "Direct. No ceremony." "Thank you," she said. "My north fence line," he said. "Someone's been at it. I thought it was the Barker boys being stupid, but—" He looked at the notebook. "The date you have for the first moved stake. That's the same week I found my fence disturbed." Coulter felt something settle in his chest, heavy and certain. "Have you had any contact from a man named Garland?" Nell asked. "Or from an agent named Fitch?" "Fitch came to me in March," Webb said. "Said he represented an investment concern interested in expanding cattle operations in the valley. Made me an offer for the whole spread. He named a figure." Coulter did the math in his head. It was low. Low enough to be an insult, but not so low that it couldn't be argued as reasonable. "You declined," Nell said. "I told him to get off my land," Webb said, "which is not quite the same thing, but means the same." He picked up the water jug and refilled all 3 cups with a steady hand. "Who else is he talking to?" he said. "We're trying to find out," Nell said. "That's why we're here." Webb looked at her steadily. "You know what you're poking at, girl." "I have a general idea. Men with money and lawyers and time," he said. "They don't like it when people from small ranches start comparing notes. They make it uncomfortable." "They're already making it uncomfortable," she said. "They're just hoping we don't know it." Webb was quiet for a moment, his big leather hands resting on the table on either side of his water cup. "My youngest boy," he said. "He's a surveyor in Provo, trained, licensed, knows the county standards." He looked at Coulter. "If your markers have been moved and you want to establish what the ground actually says, a licensed survey is the only thing that holds up in a land dispute." "That costs money," Coulter said. "It does," Webb said. "Split 3 ways, it costs less." He looked between them. "I'll reach out to the Mendez family. You talk to Pruitt. If we can get 4 or 5 names behind a formal complaint to the land office, it's harder to dismiss than 1. They left Webb's place in the late afternoon, the sun already lower and the air barely cooler, Nell sitting beside him on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead. "He believed us," Coulter said. "He believed the notebook," she said. "Not correcting him, just being precise." "Same thing." She shook her head slightly. "It's not. People believe documents, people believe dates and numbers. That's why I keep writing them down." She paused. "Feelings don't hold up in a land office. Numbers do." He thought about that for the rest of the ride home. The sabotage escalated in the 3rd week of June. It started small. A water barrel that had been fine the evening before was cracked at the base by morning, leaking out into the dirt. A length of rope from the equipment shed went missing. Coulter found one of the cattle in the upper pasture with a cut on its rear leg that hadn't come from any fence he could identify. A straight cut, too clean, and too placed to be accidental. Each thing was explainable. That was the point. You couldn't go to anyone with a cracked barrel and a missing rope and a cut that might have come from a wire. You'd sound like a man looking for problems that weren't there. But Nell was writing it all down, every day, in her book. Date, time, what was found, condition of the surrounding area, whether any tracks were visible. She'd started asking Aurelio to do the same, in a separate smaller notebook she'd given him, so there were 2 independent records of everything. "Why 2 records?" Coulter asked. "Because 1 record is a story," she said. 2 records are evidence. He didn't ask her how she knew that. He was getting better at not asking her things that had answers he'd learn on their own. The tension in the valley was something you could feel by then, like the pressure before a storm. Walt Deering had come by the feed barn in town and said, not to Coulter but loudly enough that Coulter was meant to hear, that if the drought kept up, the small ranches would all go under by fall, regardless of whatever land schemes anyone was worried about. Agnes Pruitt had told 3 people, It got back to Coulter within a week because nothing that Agnes Pruitt said stayed unreported. That Coulter Ashby had always had more pride than sense, and that the girl he'd married was putting ideas in his head that were going to get him buried. The ideas she was putting in his head were making the ranch function better than it ever had. But that was not the kind of detail Agnes Pruitt put in her reports. The Caldwell boys rode past the property twice more. The second time, Nell was in the garden, which had been doing better than anyone had expected, partly because she'd restructured the rows to shade the most water-sensitive plants during the worst midday heat. And she watched them ride past without moving, without changing what she was doing, just watching. Coulter had seen her from the barn and come out. "Don't," she said, before he could start walking toward the road. "They're counting fence posts," he said. "I know, let them count." She went back to the garden. "I'd rather they underestimate us." He stood there for a moment. "You think they report back to Fitch?" "I think someone does," she said. "Maybe them. Maybe someone else in town." She didn't look up from what she was doing. Think about it. Fitch needs to know when to move. He needs to know when a family is weak enough to accept a low offer. Someone is telling him. Agnes Pruitt. "She talks to everyone and she's angry that you didn't take her husband's advice," she said. "She's not necessarily doing it intentionally. She might just be talking." She sat back on her heels. "That's sometimes how it works. The person feeding information doesn't always know they're doing it." He watched her pull a weed from between two small plants with a precise, economical movement, exactly enough effort and no more. "How do you know all these things?" he said. Not the same question as before. Not asking about the accounting or the food storage. Something else. She kept working. A long moment passed. "My cousin's husband in Pittsburgh," she said. "He was a businessman. I watched him operate for 8 months. How he managed information. How he kept people from knowing what he was actually doing. How he used other people's ignorance as a tool." She paused. "I was one of those people for most of it. Until I wasn't." She looked up. "That's what I meant when I wrote that staying where I was wasn't a choice I was willing to make anymore. I watched a man I was supposed to be grateful to run schemes on people who trusted him, and I decided I'd rather die in a wagon heading west than spend another day pretending I didn't see it." It was the most she'd told him at once about where she'd come from. He stood in the heat and took it in. "Did he hurt you?" he said carefully. She looked at him for a moment. "Not the way you mean. Just the slow way. The kind that doesn't leave marks." He nodded. He didn't push it. There were things you didn't push, and he was learning which ones they were. "Then you know what we're dealing with," he said. "I know exactly what we're dealing with," she said, "which is why I've been writing everything down since the day I got here." July came in hot and merciless, and the well dropped another 8 inches, and they sold the second steer at a decent price in Millhaven and came home to find the gate to the near pasture open and 2 of the remaining cattle 2 miles down the valley road. Getting them back took 4 hours and cost Aurelio a bad fall from his horse trying to cut them off on the rocky ground. Nothing broken, but his wrist was badly sprained and he couldn't use it for a week, which meant Coulter was doing 2 men's work in the worst heat of the summer. Nell found him one evening sitting on the step of the house with his boots still on, which was something he never did. He always took his boots off at the door, just sitting there too tired to move. She sat down on the step beside him, not close enough to be intrusive, just near. "You need help," she said. "I know that. The Mendez boys," she said. "Diego's 2 older sons. I spoke to Maria Mendez at the well last week. She said they're looking for work. They know cattle. I can't pay them. Not in cash, but you have something Diego Mendez has wanted for 2 years. She looked at him sideways. "Water rights. Your creek easement covers the lower meadow that borders his north property. Give him summer water rights in exchange for his boys' labor through harvest." He turned his head and looked at her. "I mentioned it to Maria," she said, casually. "She mentioned it to Diego. He hasn't said no." He sat there for a moment. "You arranged this without telling me," he said. "I gathered information without telling you," she said. "There's a difference. I didn't commit to anything. I wanted to know if the option existed before I brought it to you." She met his eyes. "If you don't like it, say so." He was quiet for a long moment. The evening was coming in cooler, finally, and a thin strip of orange was burning out on the western horizon. and somewhere in the upper pasture the remaining cattle were settling for the night. "Tell Diego to send his boys Monday," he said. She nodded and looked back at the horizon. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable, and the ranch was still standing, and it was neither of those things because the summer had been kind, because it hadn't been kind at all. It was still standing because two people who hadn't been supposed to make it had refused, so far, to stop. Nell pulled her shawl tighter against the first breath of evening air. Her legs were aching. They always ached more in the heat, and the day had been long, and she was tired in a way that went bone deep. But she was there. She was still there. And across the valley, in the direction of properties already sold and fences already moved, something was building toward a breaking point that she could feel the way you feel weather coming. Not in the air yet, but in everything that surrounded the air. She kept her face calm and her hands still, and didn't say any of that to Coulter, because he already knew, and saying it out loud wouldn't make it slower in its coming. She just sat and watched the last of the light go, and thought about what they still had, and what it was going to take to keep it. The storm came in from the northwest on a Wednesday, which was wrong for that time of year. Late summer storms in the territory came up from the south, usually. You could see them building for hours, great dark columns of cloud stacking themselves against the mountains like something with intention. This one arrived differently. It moved fast and low, and the sky went the color of a bad bruise in about 40 minutes, and by the time Coulter came down from the upper pasture, the wind was already pulling at things. "That's not a normal one," Aurelio said, coming out of the barn with his hat pressed to his head. "No," Coulter said. "Get the horses in." They'd been through dry storms before, the kind that brought lightning and wind and almost no rain, which were worse than rainstorms because the lightning had nothing to put itself out with. The territory had burned that way twice in the 4 years Coulter had been here, once badly enough that the Sutter place on the eastern ridge had lost its outbuildings and barely saved the house. He moved the cattle himself, all 6 of the remaining animals, into the main barn with Aurelio's help, and they brought the 2 Mendez boys, Ernesto and Luis, who'd been working the property since August and had turned out to be exactly the kind of steady, undemanding help that made a hard situation manageable, in from the far pasture where they'd been restringing fence. Nell was on the porch when he got back to the house, watching the sky with her arms crossed and her notebook in one hand. "There's a fire smell," she said. He stopped, lifted his nose. She was right. Underneath the mineral smell of the coming storm, there was something else, faint and dry and wrong. "Wind's coming from the northwest," he said. "Which is where the Caldwell property is," she said. They looked at each other. "Could be them burning trash," he said. "Could be," she said. Her voice said she didn't think so. He sent Aurelio up to the high ground behind the house, a rocky outcrop that gave a view north and west, and told him to look hard and come back fast. While Aurelio was gone, Coulter filled every available bucket and barrel from the well, working quickly even though the well was still low, because if it was a fire and it was coming, water on hand was the only thing that mattered. Nell helped without being asked, carrying the smaller buckets herself, making 3 trips for everyone she could manage before he told her to stop. "I'm fine," she said. "You've been on your feet since 5 this morning," he said. "Sit down for 10 minutes. You'll be more used to me if you're not falling over." She sat down. He could see her not liking it, the way her jaw set, but she sat. Aurelio came back in 7 minutes. "Fire," he said, breathing hard from the run. "North side. It's not the Caldwell place and it's further east, but it's moving." "How big?" Aurelio held his hands apart, then wider, and growing. "The wind is pushing it." Coulter turned to Nell. "Get the notebooks, both of them, the survey, the ledger, the letters from Tomas. Everything in the box under the table. Put it in the grain sack with the metal buckles, not the canvas ones." She was already moving toward the door. "And the cash in the boot box," she said, not a question. "Yes." "And the deed papers?" "Yes." She went inside. He turned to Aurelio and the Mendez boys and started telling them what to do. "Yeah." The rain came first, which was the deceptive part. It came in hard around 8 o'clock. A genuine hammering rain that turned the yard to mud in 20 minutes, and made Coulter think for about half an hour that the fire threat was over and they could stand down. Then the rain stopped as fast as it had started, the way these storms sometimes did. dumping everything at once, moving through, leaving the air washed and the ground wet only on the surface, the deep drought-hardened earth underneath unchanged. The wind picked back up, stronger now and colder, and the fire smell was back, much stronger. Ernesto came running from the direction of the barn at a dead run, which was the first time Coulter had seen the young man run anywhere. "The south barn," Ernesto said, and he was pointing and his face was wrong in a way that made Coulter's stomach drop. He ran. The south barn, the secondary structure they'd been using for equipment storage and hay, was lit. Not a little lit. Not a fire that had caught and could be smothered. Lit the way something lit when someone had helped it along, because hay burns fast, but it doesn't usually go up on three sides at the same time. Coulter stopped 30 feet from the building and felt the heat against his face like an open oven, and understood in about 2 seconds that the barn was gone. That was done. The question was the main barn. He turned around and nearly ran into Nell. "There are people on the north ridge," she said. She was breathing hard from moving fast, which she couldn't do well yet, and she had the grain sack over her shoulder. "I saw lanterns, at least 3, moving along the tree line." "Lanterns don't move like that in a storm unless someone's carrying them," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. In the firelight, her face was all angles and shadow, and her eyes were completely steady, which was remarkable given that the secondary barn was 30 feet away, burning to its foundations. "The main barn," he said. "If they're going to do it right, that's next. That's where the livestock are." "Aurelio," she said immediately. "He's still in there." Coulter was already running. The main barn was not yet on fire. He could see that as he crossed the yard, the structure dark against the burning orange behind it. But the smell of smoke was everywhere now, and the animals inside were making the sound that livestock make when they know something is wrong before the humans do. A low collective noise that was worse than screaming would have been. He threw open the barn doors, and the horses surged immediately. He got out of the way and let them go. They'd find the far pasture and stay there. Horses weren't stupid about fire. And then went back in for the cattle. Aurelio was already there, had already gotten 2 of the 6 loose, and was working on a 3rd. They worked without talking, just moving, because there wasn't anything to say, and the smoke was getting thicker. They got 5 out. The 6th, the youngest heifer, had gotten herself turned around in the back of her stall and wouldn't move. Panic had locked her in place, and she was pressing herself into the corner with the whites of her eyes showing. Coulter went in after her. He got a rope around her neck and pulled, and she was dead weight, 500 pounds of terrified animal, and he was pulling with everything he had, and she wasn't moving. Then something hit the back of the barn, a sound like a heavy object striking wood, and a section of the rear wall shuddered. Aurelio appeared beside him. Together, they pulled. The heifer broke loose from whatever had frozen her and came forward in a lurching scramble that nearly knocked Coulter down. And they got her out the barn doors just as a section of the roof on the south side of the main barn caught, not from the fire, which was still mostly contained to the secondary structure, but from an ember carried on the wind, landing in dried material on the roof that the rain hadn't wet enough. Coulter stood in the yard and watched the barn begin to burn from the top, and thought very clearly they planned this. The secondary barn first, because that's where they knew they could get a fire going fast with stored hay. The chaos of the storm to cover their movements, the rain to make him relax. And then the main barn while his attention was on the first fire. He looked at Nell. She was looking at the tree line to the north, the direction she'd seen the lanterns. Her face was not frightened, it was angry, and focused in the way that anger sometimes becomes when there's nowhere to put it yet, and you know you have to wait. "Luis," she said. Luis Mendez was standing 10 feet away watching the barn roof. "Luis, the irrigation ditch on the south side of the property, where does it connect?" Luis turned. "Señora? The old irrigation channel, the stone one. Where does it go?" He looked uncertain. "It goes to the lower field, but it's been dry since, I mean the channel itself, the physical channel. How wide is it? How deep?" "Maybe." He spread his hands. "A meter wide, half-meter deep, stone walls." She turned to Coulter. "I walked that channel in June," she said, "when I was mapping the water sources. It runs from the south side of the main barn all the way to the lower meadow. About 400 yards. It's stone-lined so the walls are solid. It's below ground level, so it's sheltered from the wind. She looked at him. If the fire spreads from the barn toward the house, and with this wind it will, we need a way to move people through it without going across open ground. He stared at her. You want to use a dry irrigation ditch as an evacuation route. I want to have it ready, she said, in case we need it. I want Ernesto to go open the south access point right now so we know it's clear. She looked at Ernesto. Can you do that? Ernesto looked at Coulter. Go, Coulter said. Oh. What happened in the next 2 hours was the kind of thing that afterward, when people asked, nobody could describe in a way that made complete sense. Emergencies are like that. They compress and stretch time in uneven ways so that some moments are very slow and detailed, and others are just a blur of motion and noise. What Coulter could reconstruct afterward was this. Somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock, while he and Aurelio were working to contain the spread of the barn fire, using the water they'd stored and everything else they could find, 3 men came out of the darkness from the north side of the property. They weren't subtle about it, which told him something. They weren't there to steal. They came with the deliberate, unhurried movement of men who believed they were in charge of what happened next. There was a 4th man he didn't see until later. The 3 visible men stopped about 20 yards from the house. One of them, big, in a dark coat, a bandana pulled up over his face, called out, Ashby, smart thing to do right now is walk away. You're going to lose the barn either way. Don't lose more than that. Coulter was standing between them and the house. He had a rifle, which he'd grabbed from the house before the situation had escalated. He was also aware that he was one man with a rifle in firelight against 3 men whose faces he couldn't see, in a yard full of smoke and shadow. Get off my land, he said. That's a poor choice, the man said. Not threateningly, just practically, like someone explaining why you shouldn't step on a rake. You come on a man's property in the dark with your face covered and burn his barn, and then you want to give advice, Coulter said. I'm not real interested. The man started to say something else. A sound came from the south side of the property, from the direction of the irrigation channel, a door of some kind opening. Ernesto's voice, low and calling something in Spanish that Coulter couldn't make out. The 3 men turned their heads. Coulter used that second. He moved fast to the left, into the shadow of what remained of the fence near the house. And from there, he could see things differently. He could see that one of the 3 men was younger than the others and was nervous. You could see it in how he was standing. He could see that they'd spread out slightly, which was how you moved when you expected one person in front of you. And he could see the 4th man, who'd been at the back corner of the house and had not moved yet, and who was holding something that, in the firelight, was clearly not a rifle. It was a lamp, a kerosene lamp. Coulter said very clearly, You put that down, or I will put you down. The 4th man, younger still, he could see it now, barely 20, froze. Put it down, Coulter said again. The lamp went down. The man stepped back. The standoff in the yard lasted about 30 seconds more, and then the big man in the dark coat said something to the others that Coulter couldn't catch, and they pulled back. Not running. Walking backward into the dark, unhurried again, as if nothing had been decided yet. Coulter stood in the yard until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he sat down on the ground, which wasn't a decision. His legs just stopped holding him up, and sat there for a moment in the mud with the fire behind him. The main barn lost its roof on the south side. The walls held. The secondary barn was gone to the foundation, which was stone, so the foundation remained. The house was untouched. They worked until 2 in the morning, getting the fire in the main barn roof fully out. Everyone, Coulter, Aurelio, Ernesto, Luis, and Nell, who would not be told to go inside and did not go, passing buckets and beating at embers and doing the grinding, unglamorous work of preventing a disaster from becoming a catastrophe. At some point, without anyone deciding it had happened, the fire was out. Nell sat down on an overturned water barrel and didn't get up for a while. Coulter came and stood near her. He was black with smoke, and his hands were blistered on the palms from a section of fence he'd grabbed in the dark without thinking, and he was so tired that the ground felt like it was moving slightly. "The heifer is okay?" she said. "All 6 are in the far pasture," he said. Aurelio counted. She nodded. She was pressing one hand against her left leg, which she always did when the pain was bad, and she was trying not to show it. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours straight. "You should have gone inside," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't." He didn't say anything else about it. After a moment, she reached into the grain sack she'd had over her shoulder all evening and pulled out her notebook. In the dark, he couldn't see what she was writing, but she was writing something, and he realized she was writing down the time and what had happened and what she'd seen. "You're documenting this right now," he said. Not incredulous, just noting it. "The man in the dark coat had a scar above his left ear," she said, writing. "I saw it when he turned toward the south. The youngest one, the one by the house, he had a particular way of walking. Left foot turns out slightly. I'd know him again." She didn't look up. Ernesto saw their horses tied at the North Ridge. He says there were 4 horses. One was a gray with a black mane, distinctive. She looked up. "Did you see anything I missed?" He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. "The big one's voice," he said. "He's not from here. His accent is Eastern, not territory, not mountain, maybe Denver, maybe further east." She wrote it down. Luis Mendez came and crouched near them, his face exhausted and smoke darkened. "My father will want to know about this," he said. "He will be angry." "Tell him tomorrow," Nell said. "Let him sleep." "He won't sleep when he hears." "Then let him not sleep somewhere warm," she said. Luis almost smiled. He got up and went to find his brother. Aurelio came last, moving stiffly from the long hours and the aggravated wrist. He looked at the burned structure and at the surviving one and at Coulter without saying anything for a moment. "The 4th man," Aurelio said finally. "The one with the lamp. I've seen that walk before." Nell looked at him. "Where?" "In town. He works at Deering's feed barn." He paused. "Walt Deering's place." The name sat between them in the smoky dark. Walt Deering, who had told the story of the stagecoach arrival more times than anyone had counted, whose feed barn was the center of information in Harlan's Crossing, who had never missed an opportunity to speak about Coulter Ashby's failing ranch within earshot of anyone who'd listen. "You're certain about the walk?" Nell said. "The left foot," Aurelio said. "Yes." Nell didn't look at her notebook. She didn't need to. She'd written it down already. "All right," she said quietly. She put the notebook back in the grain sack. She pressed both hands on the barrel she was sitting on and stood up slowly, with her jaw tight and her back straight and the fire smell heavy on everything around them. "The evidence we've been collecting," she said to Coulter. "The survey discrepancies, the fence posts, the dates of every incident since April, the letters from Tomas, what we saw tonight." She looked at the burned barn and back at him. "It's not just a neighbor harassing us anymore. They sent men to burn us out. That's a different category of thing." "I know," he said. "We need the other families," she said. "Webb, Mendez, Pruitt, anyone else who's been touched by this. We need to move before they try again." "They'll try again soon," Coulter said. "They didn't finish what they came to do." "I know that too." She turned to look north, toward the direction the men had come from and the direction they'd retreated to, the dark ridge with its dark tree line. "But we have something now we didn't have before." He looked at her sideways. "Whoa, what's that?" "They made a mistake," she said. "They used someone local, someone recognizable." She glanced toward where Aurelio had been standing. "They got sloppy because they thought we'd be too scared to look carefully. They thought we'd spend tonight panicking instead of watching." Coulter thought about the young man by the corner of the house, the lamp going down, the walk that turned left. "Walt Deering," he said. "Walt Deering," she said. "Which means there's a chain. Deering to someone, someone to Fitch, Fitch to Cascade Land, Cascade Land to whoever Garland actually is." She looked at him. "Pull one link and the rest follow." He stood in the ruined yard of his ranch in the small hours of the morning, the barn roof partially open to the sky, his cattle scattered in the far pasture, his hands blistered and his body past tired and into something that had gone past tired a long time ago. "You think we can actually prove this?" he said. "I think we already have most of it," she said. "I think we need 3 or 4 more pieces and someone official enough to receive them." She paused. "There's a federal land agent in the territory. Not county, federal. His office is in Salt Lake City. County officials can be leaned on. Federal ones are harder." "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. Since June, she said, when I found the first moved survey stake. I started building toward it then. She looked at him directly. I should have told you sooner. I wanted to have more before I said it out loud. He was quiet for a moment. Tell me now, he said. Tell me all of it. They sat in the dark yard with the fire smell and the distant sound of the cattle settling and the ruined barn at their backs, and she told him. Everything she'd been assembling since June, not just the notebook entries, but the logic of it, the shape of what Cascade Land was doing and who was helping them do it, and what it would take to prove it to someone who had the authority to act on proof. She talked for almost an hour. He listened the way he'd learned to listen to her, without interrupting, taking it in. When she finished, the sky to the east had a thin gray line along the bottom edge that meant dawn was coming, still 2 hours out, but thinking about it. The federal agent, he said. Do you have a name? I have a name, she said. Tomas found it. A man named Aldridge. He's been working land fraud cases in Nevada, and he came to the territory 3 months ago. She looked at him, which might not be a coincidence. Someone else already complained, Coulter said. Or Aldridge already knows, she said, and he's waiting for someone to give him what he needs to move. We could be that someone, Coulter said. We could be, she said. But not alone. We need the other families. We need Webb's name, and Diego Mendez's name, and as many others as we can get, because one small ranch with a complaint is a nuisance. 5 ranches with documented evidence is a case. He looked at her. In the growing pre-dawn gray, she was all hollows and angles, smoke-stained, exhausted, one hand still pressed against her leg where the pain was. She'd walked a dry irrigation ditch in June because she wanted to understand the property. She'd mapped it in her notebook, and tonight she'd remembered it when they needed it. He thought about what Hector Pruitt had said on the road the day she arrived. You can't work a ranch with that. He thought about Walt Deering's laugh. He thought about Agnes Pruitt's pressed lips and the Caldwell boys on their horses counting his fence posts. He thought about what it had cost her to get on 3 different stagecoaches, sick and thin and alone, and show up anyway. First light, he said. I'll ride to Webb. I'll write the letter to Aldridge, she said. Tonight, before I sleep. She paused. We should also check whether Deering's boy, the one with the walk, is still in town. If he ran, that tells us something. If he's still there acting normal, that tells us something else. What does it tell us if he's still there? That they don't know we recognized him, she said, which means we have time. She stood up carefully from the barrel, steadying herself with one hand, and picked up the grain sack. Which means we can choose when they find out. She walked toward the house. At the door she stopped and looked back at the yard. The burned-out secondary barn. The main barn with its ruined roof, the churned mud and scattered buckets, and all the wreckage of the night. Coulter, she said. Yeah. The ranch is still standing, she said. It was not a statement of comfort, exactly. It was not the kind of thing you said when you wanted to make someone feel better. It was more like a fact that needed to be spoken to be properly understood. The way you'd say the bridge held after a flood, noting it, registering it, filing it against the harder days ahead. Yeah, he said. It is. She went inside. He stood in the yard a moment longer, looking north toward the dark ridge and the tree line where the lanterns had moved, and he thought about chains of evidence and federal agents and the specific look on the face of the young man who'd put down the lamp when told to. Scared, that young man had been. Not committed, just paid, or coerced, or both. That was something. That was the kind of detail that cracked things open sometimes, when you found the right place to press. He turned and followed her inside, pulling the door against the night. The main barn's broken roof let in the stars on the south side, and the cattle would need water at first light, and there was enough damage that a week of hard work wouldn't fully repair it. And somewhere in the valley, men who wanted this land were sleeping and planning and would try again. But the ranch was standing. For now, that was what there was, and it would have to be enough. Coulter rode to Webb's place at first light, before he'd slept, before he'd eaten, while the smoke smell was still in his clothes and the blisters on his palms had crusted over enough to grip the reins. Webb was already up. Webb was always already up. The man seemed to operate on a different relationship with sleep than most people, as if he'd decided somewhere in his 7th decade that sleep was a negotiation he was winning by needing less of it. He was at his fence when Coulter rode in, doing something to a post with a mallet, and he straightened and looked at Coulter's face and put the mallet down. "Tell me," he said. Coulter told him. Webb listened without any expression changing, which was different from not reacting. Coulter could see him taking it in, processing it, filing it against whatever he already knew. When Coulter got to the part about the young man with the turned-out walk and Aurelio's identification, Webb's jaw tightened visibly. "Deering's boy," he said. "That's Pete Ransom. He's not Deering's boy exactly. He works for him. Came from somewhere in Colorado about a year ago." "You know him?" "I know he's been seen twice at the Caldwell place after hours." Webb looked at the fence post he'd been working on. "I didn't think much of it at the time. The Caldwells hire seasonal." He looked back at Coulter. "I'm thinking more of it now." "Nell wants to bring the families together," Coulter said. "All of us. One meeting, everything on the table. She's written a letter to a federal land agent named Aldridge." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Aldridge?" he said. "You know the name?" "I know the name," Webb said. "He was in Millhaven in July. I didn't know why. A friend at the county seat mentioned someone from the federal office asking questions about land transfer records." He looked at Coulter directly. "Your wife wrote him a letter." "Last night," Coulter said, "after the fire." Webb picked up his mallet, looked at it, set it back down. It was the closest Coulter had ever seen him come to a nervous gesture. "All right," Webb said. "Bring them here. My place is bigger, and I'm further from town, which means less chance of it getting back to Deering before we're ready." He paused. "When?" 3 days, Coulter said. "Nell says 3 days. Enough time to reach everyone, not enough time for word to travel before we meet." "She's right," Webb said simply. He picked up his mallet again. "Go home and sleep, Coulter. You look like something a horse dragged, but set." The letter to Aldridge went out with the Thursday mail rider, sealed, with a separate note on the outside of the envelope asking the writer to hold it for federal collection rather than local delivery. Nell had thought of that. Local delivery meant it went through the Harlan's crossing post, which meant it sat in a building adjacent to Walt Deering's feed barn, and she wasn't willing to trust that. She'd spent 3 hours on the letter before Coulter had made her stop and sleep. He'd read what she had and told her it was enough. It wasn't a warm letter. It was a document. Dates, names, incident descriptions. The Tomas correspondence quoted carefully, the survey discrepancies measured and recorded. It read the way a lawyer's brief reads, except that it was written by a woman who'd never gone to law school and had learned everything she knew about evidence from watching a dishonest man try to hide things for 8 months in Pittsburgh. She'd signed it Eleanor Ashby, Ashby Ranch, Harlan's Crossing, Utah Territory without ceremony. Coulter had read the signature and not said anything. She'd noticed him not saying anything. "Is that all right?" she said. "Using the name on the letter, it sounds more established than Voss." "It's your name," he said. "Use it however you want." She looked at him for a moment. "I mean, legally. At some point, it should be properly." She stopped. "It should," he said. "We'll go to Millhaven when this is done and make it proper, if you want." "I want," she said, without elaboration, without the soft framing she sometimes put around things that mattered to her. Just, "I want." He'd nodded and gone to bed, and she'd finished the letter, and in the morning when he woke up, she was already asleep at the table with her head on her arm and the sealed envelope beside her hand. He'd carried her to the cot without waking her, which she was light enough for now that it wasn't difficult, and that had surprised him. Not that he could do it, but that it reminded him of how much had changed since April. She was still not a small woman, but she was a different woman than the one who'd stepped off the stagecoach, and not just in ways you could measure. The meeting at Webb's place was on a Saturday, the last Saturday of August, in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had moved on. They came carefully, one family at a time, arriving by different routes the way people arrive when they're trying not to look like they're all going to the same place. Diego Mendez and his wife Maria. Hector Pruitt, without Agnes, who Hector said was unwell, which Nell interpreted to mean Agnes had refused to come to anything organized by a woman she'd dismissed 6 months ago. Old Webb himself. A man named Sam Torrance from the far north of the valley, who had a small sheep operation and who Coulter had barely spoken to before, but who had shown up at Aurelio's suggestion because Aurelio's sister-in-law was married to Torrance's hired hand and word had moved through that channel. 6 adults around Webb's large table, plus Aurelio standing near the wall because there weren't enough chairs and he'd refused to take anyone else's. Nell put her notebooks on the table. Both of them. "I'll make this short because some of you have long rides home," she said. She'd never addressed a room of people before in her life, and it showed slightly. Her voice was level, but she held the edge of the table with one hand, steadying herself without drawing attention to it. Cascade Land and Cattle has acquired 3 properties in this valley in the last 8 months at below-market prices. Their registered agent is a lawyer named Fitch out of Mill Haven. The actual controlling interest behind Cascade is a man named Garland, but his name doesn't appear on the paperwork, which tells you something about how much he trusts the legality of what he's doing. She paused. Let that settle. 3 properties already. Ours has been targeted with 6 separate incidents of sabotage since April, all documented here. She tapped the notebook. 2 weeks ago, they sent men to burn our barns. We identified one of them as Pete Ransom, who works at Deering's feed barn in town. Another pause. I don't think Walt Deering organized this. I think he talked the way he always talks. And someone with Cascade's operation used him as a source of information about who in this valley was struggling and how badly. Hector Pruitt shifted in his seat. His face was doing something complicated. Deering knows everything that happens in this county before it happens, Hector said. That's not an accident. No, Nell said. It's not. But I think he's a tool more than a planner. The planner is Fitch, and above Fitch is Garland. She looked around the table. Has anyone here been approached with an offer? Since April, specifically. Torrance raised his hand. June, he said. Man came out, didn't give a name at first. Said he represented an investment company looking to consolidate grazing land. Offered me $1,800 for the whole spread. What's it worth? Nell asked. $3,000, easy, maybe more with the water rights. Same pattern, she said to the room. Low offer, deniable agent, no paper trail leading to Garland. She looked at Diego Mendez. Diego, the South 40 we sold you in April. Has anyone approached you about it since? Diego looked at his wife and back at Nell. In July, same thing. A man. He said the parcel was poorly positioned for goat grazing and he could take it off my hands at a fair price. I told him the price he named was not fair and he left. He'll be back, Nell said, or someone like him will. So what do we do? Torrance said. He was a direct man, Coulter had decided, the kind of person who sat through context patiently because he knew it mattered, but whose real question was always the practical one. We've sent a letter to a federal land agent named Aldridge, Nell said. He's in the territory already. We believe he may already be investigating Cascade Land, which means he needs what we have more than we need him. She put both hands flat on the notebooks. But a letter from one ranch is a complaint. A documented record from 6 families is evidence of a coordinated scheme. That's a different legal category. You want us to sign something, Pruitt said. I want you to tell me what's happened to your properties, she said. And if it matches the pattern, I want your names on a joint statement to Aldridge's office. She looked at him directly. Hector, you told me in March to send her back. You told Coulter she'd drag him under. Pruitt looked at the table. You were wrong about that, she said. Not unkindly, just factually. But you were right that something was rotten in this valley, and you've known it longer than I have. What have you seen? A long pause. Aurelio was very still against the wall. My north fence, Pruitt said at last. Survey stakes, moved, same as yours. I thought it was a boundary dispute with old man Kellner, but Kellner died in May, and his heirs are in Ohio, and they haven't been near the property. He rubbed his jaw. And last month, someone cut the supply line to my stock tank. I repaired it, didn't tell anyone. Why didn't you tell anyone, Nell asked. Because I didn't want to sound like a man who couldn't manage his own property, he said, and the honesty of it landed heavily in the room. None of us did, Torrance said quietly. That's how it works, Nell said. They make every incident small enough to be embarrassing to report. You feel like the problem is yours. You don't know your neighbor is dealing with the same thing. She looked around the table. That isolation is the strategy. It's not accidental. The room was quiet for a moment. Webb spoke for the first time since the meeting had started. I'll sign, he said. Just that. But Webb's signature on anything in this valley carried a specific weight that other names didn't. and everyone in the room knew it, and the quality of the silence shifted slightly. Diego Mendez nodded. My family also. Torrance. Yes. Pruitt looked at the table for another moment. Then he looked at Nell. I owe you an apology, he said. Not just for what I said in March, for not coming to you sooner when I started seeing what you were seeing. Write it down and sign it, she said. That's the apology I need. Bah. Aldridge replied 12 days later. His letter was brief and official in tone, but the content of it made Nell sit down in the middle of reading it, which was not something she did. He had been in the territory since June. He had been building a case against Cascade Land and Cattle since March, when a land transfer in Nevada had flagged certain irregularities that a colleague had passed along. He had 6 other properties in 2 counties already documented. He needed, he wrote, physical evidence of coercion, not just survey discrepancies and low offers, which could be argued as legal if aggressive business practice, but direct evidence of property destruction or physical intimidation attributable to Cascade's operation. The barn fire, he wrote, was exactly the kind of evidence he needed if it could be tied to Cascade. And Pete Ransom, he wrote, and this was the part that made Nell sit down, was already known to his office. Ransom had a record in Colorado. Arson, among other things. He'd been working for a subcontractor who had done work for Cascade Land in Nevada 18 months ago. Nell read that paragraph 3 times. They brought him in specifically, she said when Coulter came in from the field. She showed him the letter. He read it standing up. Then he read it again. Ransom isn't local, he said. Deering's just where he landed. They placed him. Yes, she said, which means Garland was planning physical coercion from the beginning. The low offers weren't the real strategy. They were the first step. The real strategy was burn out whoever said no. And Ransom is the tie between Cascade and the fire, Coulter said. If we can put him at the fire with witnesses and connect him to Cascade's payroll. She looked at the letter. Aldridge says he can do the payroll piece. He has subpoena authority, but he needs the witnesses for the fire. Aurelio, Coulter said. Ernesto, Luis. And me, she said. I saw his walk before Aurelio did. Coulter set the letter down. Aldridge is going to come here. He wants to meet at Webb's place, she said. He specifically asked that it not be in town. When? He's asking for the last week of September. She paused. He says to tell no one outside the families already involved, specifically no one connected to Deering's operation. She looked at Coulter. He knows about Deering. He's been building this for months, Coulter said. Yes, she said. And he's been waiting for someone in this valley to give him an opening. She folded the letter carefully. We're the opening. The last week of September brought cooler weather and a genuine rain, 3 days of steady, soaking rain that the well drank gratefully, and the pasture turned green from too late in the season to mean much, but welcome anyway after the summer's cruelty. The cattle came back to condition slowly. The barn roof, which Coulter and Ernesto and Luis had repaired through August with Webb's help and Webb's lumber, held through the rain without a leak. Aldridge arrived on a Tuesday, which Nell had begun to think of as the valley's official day for important events. He came alone, which surprised her, and he was younger than she'd pictured from his letters. Maybe 35, compact and careful-looking, with the particular kind of watchfulness that belongs to people who spend their professional lives reading rooms. He shook her hand first, which also surprised her, and said, Mrs. Ashby, your letter was the most organized piece of correspondence I've received in 4 years of this work. I want you to know that before we get into anything else. It needed to be organized, she said. Otherwise, it was just a complaint. Most of what I receive is just a complaint, he said. Please introduce me to everyone. They met at Webb's table again, the same people as before, plus Aldridge and a younger man he'd brought after all, introduced only as his associate, who sat against the wall and took notes. Aldridge laid out his case with the same economy Nell had used in her letter. Dates, names, structure. Cascade Land and Cattle had acquired 11 properties across 2 territories in 18 months. 8 of those acquisitions had followed a documented pattern of pressure. Low initial offer, followed by escalating property incidents, followed by a second offer, which was accepted under duress. In 3 cases, the escalation had included fire. Pete Ransom's name appears in connection with two of the three fires, Aldridge said, under different identities, which is why it took time to establish. He uses his middle name in Colorado and his mother's name in Nevada. He looked around the table. Your fire is the most recent and the most documented. Mrs. Ashby's record of the incident is detailed enough to serve as a primary source in a federal proceeding. What's the proceeding? Webb asked. Land fraud, interstate, which gives us federal jurisdiction, conspiracy to commit arson, witness intimidation. Aldridge paused. And once we have Ransom and can establish his payment chain to Cascade, which my office believes we can do within 30 days using the subpoena we filed last week, we have the predicate for a RICO filing against Garland personally. What does that mean for our land? Torrance asked. The three acquired properties in this valley, Aldridge said. If the acquisitions are found to have been obtained through criminal coercion, they're subject to reversal. The Haverford family, the Sutter claim, the Brennan homestead, those transfers could potentially be voided. The room was very quiet. Brennan took the money, Pruitt said carefully. He signed willingly. He signed under circumstances that may constitute duress if we can prove the preceding harassment was coordinated, Aldridge said. That's a legal argument. I'm not promising outcomes. I'm telling you what's possible. Nell had been watching Aldridge's associate throughout this, the young man against the wall. He was writing quickly, efficiently, and once he'd glanced up and caught her watching him. And she'd seen something in his face that told her he was paying attention to more than just the words being said. What do you need from us? She asked Aldridge. Signed sworn statements from everyone at this table regarding what they've witnessed and when. Statements from your ranch hands regarding the fire. He looked at her. And I'd like your notebooks, Mrs. Ashby. Both of them officially entered as evidence. I can give you certified copies. She'd known this was coming. She'd made copies already. Coulter had helped her, the two of them spending 3 evenings transcribing every entry into a duplicate book, and the copies were in the metal buckle grain sack under the table at home. But the originals, in her own handwriting, from the day she'd arrived, were something different. They were hers in a way that was hard to articulate. She pushed them across the table. Take good care of them, she said. Federal evidence storage, he said. They'll be safer than anywhere you could put them. What? Pete Ransom was still in Harlan's Crossing, still working at Deering's feed barn, still walking with his left foot turned out, which was a thing about a person's body that no amount of money or planning could change. Aldridge's office moved on a Thursday morning, which broke Nell's theory about Tuesdays. She heard about it from Maria Mendez, who'd heard it from Ernesto, who'd been at the feed barn buying grain when 2 men in plain clothes had walked in and spoken to Pete Ransom for about 45 seconds. And then Ransom had walked out with them and gotten into a wagon, and the wagon had driven south toward Millhaven. Ransom had not come back. What happened after that unfolded over weeks, not days, which was the part that nobody who lived through it told correctly in the retelling. They compressed it, made it feel like a single moment of justice descending, when the reality was paperwork and waiting and a cold courtroom in Millhaven and legal arguments Coulter and Nell only partially understood, and a federal judge who asked very specific questions about survey methodology that Webb's surveyor son answered for 2 hours on a Tuesday in October. The Tuesdays had come back around. Ransom talked. That was the essential thing. He had a record, and he had more sense than loyalty. And when Aldridge laid out what they had on him and what a conviction for arson in a federal proceeding would mean for the rest of his life, Ransom made his calculation and gave them Fitch. And Fitch, who had been a lawyer long enough to know when a position was indefensible, gave them Garland. Garland's actual name was Edmund Varley. He'd been operating under the Garland alias in the territory for 2 years. He had financial interests in 3 other states, 2 of which were already under separate investigation, which was why Aldridge had been sent to the territory in June and why he'd been patient enough to wait for the right opening. Nell heard this from Aldridge in a letter in November, the same week the first snow came. She read it at the table with Coulter across from her and the stove going and outside the first genuine winter quiet settling over the valley. She read it aloud. When she got to the part about Varley's other investigations, Coulter made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. The sound of a man understanding that the thing that had come for his ranch had been coming for a lot of people in a lot of places, and that stopping it here was one piece of something larger. Fitch, she said. He's agreed to testify. in exchange for reduced charges. Of course he has, Coulter said. Lawyers. Ransom gets 3 years. Fitch gets 1 in disbarment. She read further. Varley is looking at a federal indictment on 6 counts. Aldridge says he'll likely negotiate, but even a negotiated outcome means he can't operate in any territory under federal jurisdiction for 20 years. The properties, Coulter said. The 3 here. She scanned ahead. The Haverford and Sutter parcels are being held pending the outcome of the federal case. If the fraud conviction holds, reversal is possible, but not guaranteed. The families would have to pursue civil recovery. She looked up. Brennan's place is complicated. He signed too willingly. Aldridge says the law is murky. Is he going to be okay? Brennan? He has his money, she said. It wasn't a good price, but it wasn't nothing. He's somewhere in California. She put the letter down. The Haverfords might get their land back. The Sutters were just a claim. There's nobody to return it to. Outside, snow was moving across the valley in thin sheets, and the barn that they'd rebuilt was standing solid, the new roof dark against the white sky. It's not clean, Coulter said. No, she said. It's not. Some of it worked and some of it didn't. That's how it goes, she said. You stop what you can stop. The rest you document and hand to someone with more authority than you have, and hope they do better with it. She looked at the letter. Aldridge says what we gave him accelerated the case by months. He says without the fire documentation and the witness identifications, Ransom walks on insufficient evidence and Varley has time to transfer assets and disappear. Coulter was quiet for a moment. So it mattered, he said. Not a question. He knew it had, just saying it. It mattered, she said. The Valley meeting happened the week after the snow, when the roads were passable again, and the news had spread through the informal channels that served in place of any official announcement. Webb's place again. Because Webb's place had become where things happened now. There were more people this time. 12 families, some from the far edges of the valley that Nell hadn't known existed. Word of what had happened, the arrest, the federal case, the chain of evidence from a mail-order bride's notebook, had moved faster than the snow. Coulter had not expected to speak at the meeting. He was not a man who prepared remarks. But he found himself standing up at some point, with no particular plan, and saying, "Most of you know what happened. I'm not going to go through it again. What I want to say is that none of this was one person's doing. My wife," he said the word without the slight hesitation that had been there for months. It just wasn't there anymore. Figured out what we were dealing with and kept the records that proved it. Aurelio and the Mendez boys stayed when they could have left. Webb opened his door. Torrance came even when he didn't know us. Pruitt added his name when it would have been easier not to. He stopped and looked at the room. I'm saying this because the people who tried to take this valley from us were counting on us not doing any of that. They were counting on us being separate, and we weren't. He sat down. He was not a natural speaker. It was not a polished speech. He'd repeated himself once and lost the thread briefly in the middle. But when he sat down, Nell put her hand briefly on his forearm, just there and then gone, and the room was doing something with its silence that was different from the usual kind. Webb spoke after him, and Diego Mendez, and eventually Hector Pruitt, who said less than any of them, but what he said was direct and meant without qualification. I underestimated some people in this room. I'm not going to do that again. He didn't look at Nell when he said it. He didn't need to. She understood. After the meeting, when people were leaving and the room was thinning, Agnes Pruitt, who had come after all, who had been sitting in the back row the entire time without saying anything, stopped next to Nell on her way to the door. Nell looked at her. Agnes had the expression of someone who had rehearsed something and was deciding at the last moment whether to say it. Your stew recipe, Agnes said. Maria Mendez mentioned you'd shown her how to do the wild onions. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share it. It was not an apology. It was something that worked in the same general direction as an apology without being required to announce itself as one. Come by the ranch on Thursday, Nell said. I'll show you. It's easier to demonstrate than to explain. Agnes nodded once, tightly, and went out. Coulter appeared at Nell's shoulder. Did that just happen? He said quietly. Thursday, she said. Don't make it a thing. He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth. That particular almost smile she'd learned to read in the months that had accumulated between April and now. Outside, the snow had stopped and the valley was very white and very still, and somewhere under the white the land was the same land it had always been. The same difficult, beautiful, indifferent territory that gave nothing freely and took everything it wasn't actively prevented from taking. But the families going home to it that evening knew something different about it than they'd known before. They knew who their neighbors were. They knew what the neighbors had done and what the neighbors were willing to do, and that knowledge was the kind that settled into a community the way water settles into stone. Slowly, permanently, changing the shape of things without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. Nell gathered her coat and the grain sack that still held the certified copies of her notebooks. The originals were in federal storage in Salt Lake City, a fact she was still adjusting to, and walked out into the cold air with Coulter beside her. The wagon was where they'd left it. The horses were patient in the cold. The drive home was 40 minutes through the White Valley. She climbed up onto the seat, careful of the icy step, and he climbed up beside her and picked up the reins. They were a quarter-mile from Webb's place. The building already disappeared behind the ridge, when he said, "Mill Haven, before the roads get bad." "For the papers," she said. "For the papers," he said. "And the name. Make it proper, like you said." She sat with that for a moment, the cold air and the white ground and the horses moving steadily through it. "Next week," she said. "Next week," he said. And that was that. No ceremony. No soft language around it. Just two people in a wagon in the cold deciding on a thing, which was how they decided on most things, and which suited them both better than any other way would have. They went to Mill Haven on a Wednesday because the roads had dried enough after the second snow, and because Coulter had a cattle sale to arrange at the stockyards there anyway, which meant the trip paid for itself twice. That was the kind of thinking Nell had installed in him over the course of a year without either of them noticing it happening. The habit of making one journey do two things, of not spending a day when you could spend half a day and use the other half for something else. The justice of the peace was a small man named Garrett, who wore his official seal on a chain around his neck like jewelry and who performed the brief ceremony with the particular dignity of someone who understood that what seemed small from the outside was not always small to the people inside it. There were no guests. Aurelio had offered to come and Nell had told him it wasn't necessary, which was true, and that she'd prefer it quiet, which was also true. They stood in Garrett's office with its map of the territory on one wall and its filing cabinets on the other, and they said the words and signed the paper, and Garrett stamped it and shook both their hands. Outside on the Mill Haven street, with the paper folded in Nell's coat pocket, they stood for a moment in the cold, and Coulter said, "You want to eat before the stockyard?" "Yes," she said. They ate at a lunch counter that served a beef soup that was better than it had any right to be. Nell ate the whole bowl, which she mentioned because 6 months ago she wouldn't have. And Coulter said nothing about it, which was the right response. On the ride home, she held the paper through her coat pocket the whole way, not taking it out, just knowing it was there. Eleanor Ashby, properly, legally, on official paper. She'd been using the name since April. Now the territory agreed it was not a dramatic thing. It was a Wednesday thing, a practical, cold, unremarkable Wednesday thing. And it was exactly right. Winter in the territory was a different kind of hard than the summer had been. The summer was hard like an argument, loud and immediate and requiring constant response. Winter was hard like a long silence. It asked you to endure rather than fight. And some people were better at fighting than enduring, and some were the other way around. Nell turned out to be good at winter. She had always, she told Coulter once, been better at the slow problems than the fast ones. Fast problems required a body that moved quickly and a voice that carried. Slow problems required patience and records and the willingness to think 2 weeks ahead when everyone around you was thinking about today. Winter was a slow problem. You survived it by what you'd put away in the fall, by how well you'd read the signs in September, by the quality of your preparation rather than the force of your response. She'd been preparing since August. The root cellar by November held more than it had ever held in Coulter's 4 years on the property. Not extravagantly. They still weren't wealthy. The banknote had been paid, but there wasn't much past it. But sufficiently, in the careful way that sufficient becomes its own kind of abundance when you've known what genuinely not enough looks like. Dried venison. Preserved vegetables from the garden, which had outproduced anything Coulter had managed before, because Nell had restructured the planting and added the wild onion beds that Aurelio had shown her. Salt pork, correctly stored now, nowhere near the cornmeal, grain enough for the winter and into early spring. She'd written everything down, of course, in a new notebook. The third, because the first two were in federal storage and the copies lived in the grain sack under the table. The third notebook was a different color, green where the others had been brown, and it was already half full by December. The cattle herd had stabilized at 7 animals. They'd bought one replacement for the heifer lost in the summer, a young cow from the Mendez herd at a price that acknowledged the water rights arrangement still in place. The horses were sound. The barn roof, rebuilt with Webb's lumber and the labor of 4 sets of hands over 3 August weekends, had come through the first serious snow without a creak. Aurelio had stayed. Coulter had offered him a formal wage arrangement in October, drawing on the cash freed up by the banknote payment and the cattle sale in Mill Haven, and Aurelio had looked at the number and said it was acceptable. Ernesto and Luis Mendez came 2 days a week through the winter, which Diego had agreed to continue in exchange for the water rights extension through spring. It was the kind of arrangement that worked because everyone in it was getting something real, not because anyone was being generous. Nell had learned, or maybe always known, that arrangements built on generosity were fragile. Arrangements built on mutual interest held. The federal case against Edmund Varley concluded in February, which Aldridge communicated in a letter that arrived on the first genuinely warm day of the year. One of those February days in the territory that pretend to be April, just long enough to make you believe in spring, and then take it back. Varley had negotiated, as Aldridge had predicted, 6 counts reduced to 3. Reduced. No prison time, which made Nell put the letter down for a moment and look at the ceiling, but a permanent bar from operating in any federally administered territory, a financial judgment of $60,000 split among the affected properties, and a forced dissolution of Cascade land and cattle. $60,000 split 11 ways was not a fortune. For the Ashby Ranch, once the calculations worked through the legal process, it amounted to $412. Their share of the documented losses from the sabotage incidents and the fire, assessed by a federal appraiser at values Nell thought were low, but couldn't argue with because arguing required a lawyer, and lawyers cost more than the difference. $412 was 3 months of solid operating capital. It was the difference between a hard spring and a manageable one. She wrote the number in the new notebook and stared at it for a while. No prison time. Varley was somewhere. Arizona, Aldridge's letter said, which was a territory that hadn't yet crossed paths with him, living on whatever he'd managed to hold back from the judgment, which was certainly more than $60,000. The people who'd had their land taken, the Haverfords and the Sutters, were getting legal processes that might restore their claims over the next year or two. Might. The law in reversal was, as Aldridge had said, murky. Pete Ransom was in a federal work facility in Nevada. Fitch had surrendered his license and was reportedly selling insurance in Denver. Walt Deering's feed barn was still operating in Harlan's Crossing, because Deering himself had not been charged with anything. He'd been a source of information, not a participant, and the law made that distinction even when the practical difference felt thin. She'd thought about that for a while, about what it meant that a man could talk and enable harm without ever being the one who struck the match, and walk away with his business intact and his name unaffected. She'd decided, eventually, that it meant you had to be careful what you said about yourself and your neighbors in the rooms where everyone could hear. Not out of fear, out of understanding that information is not neutral, that what you say about someone's weakness or failure has a life beyond the moment you say it, and that life sometimes finds its way into the hands of people who use it for purposes you'd never intended and wouldn't endorse. She didn't think Walt Deering was a bad man in any deep sense. She thought he was a careless one. And careless, she'd learned in Pittsburgh and confirmed in the territory, could do as much damage as malicious if the conditions were right. She'd thought about whether to say this to anyone, and decided not to. Some things you understood and kept. Not because they were secrets, but because saying them in the wrong way made them into accusations, and she wasn't interested in accusations. She was interested in the future, which was a different direction entirely. Spring came for real in March, and with it came a woman named Clara Birch. She arrived on the stagecoach from the south, but not from St. Louis, from Tucson, which was an unusual direction. and she arrived alone, which was not unusual for the territory, but which drew attention in Harlan's Crossing the way single women always drew attention. She was young, maybe 21, slight and brown-haired and carrying a single bag that wasn't full, which told a story even before she told it herself. She'd come looking for work. She had a name written on a piece of paper, a name someone in Tucson had given her, someone who'd heard that there were people in this valley who helped when help was needed. The name on the paper was Nell Ashby. Nell heard about it from Maria Mendez, who'd been at the dry goods store when the stagecoach came in. She sent Coulter to town that afternoon to find the girl, because she knew what it felt like to step off a stagecoach in a place where you didn't know anyone and have no particular reason to believe it would work out. Coulter brought her back in the wagon. Clara Birch sat on the seat beside him and looked at the territory going past and didn't say much. And when they pulled up to the ranch, she looked at the house and the barn and the fence line and Nell standing on the porch, and she said quietly, "I heard you took someone in once who had nowhere to go." "I took in someone who could work," Nell said. "Can you work?" "I can cook," Clara said. "I can sew. I can read and write and do figures." "Come inside," Nell said. "I'll show you the accounts." Coulter stood by the wagon and watched this happen and thought about April, about the stagecoach arriving and the crowd on the road and Hector Pruitt saying you can't work a ranch with that, and he thought about how the thing Pruitt had been wrong about wasn't Nell's capability, which had been evident fairly quickly. What Pruitt had been wrong about was his definition of work. He'd meant physical labor, strong back, fast hands. He'd meant the kind of work you could see happening. What Nell did was also work. It was just invisible until it wasn't there, the way you don't notice infrastructure until it fails. He brought Clara's bag inside and went back to the field. Clara Birch stayed through the spring and into the summer, sleeping on the cot in the main room that had once been Nell's, contributing to the ranch in the ways she'd described. And a few she hadn't mentioned. She turned out to be good with the younger cattle, patient in a way that Coulter wasn't and that Aurelio respected. By June, Clara had stopped being a temporary arrangement and had become a fact of the place. The way Aurelio was a fact, the way the green notebook on the table was a fact. She wasn't the only one. A family named Okafor, a man and his wife and 2 sons who'd come from a failed farm in Kansas, stopped at the valley in May looking for direction and ended up staying after Diego Mendez offered the elder boy work, and Nell helped the wife, a woman named Frances, understand what the territory required in terms of food storage and water management. Frances had arrived with the wrong supplies for the climate, heavy winter goods when she needed cool weather preservation tools, and Nell had spent 2 afternoons going through what she had and what she needed and why, not as an imposition, but as the straightforward sharing of specific knowledge. Frances Okafor had cried at the end of the 2nd afternoon, which was not something Nell had expected, and which made her uncomfortable in the way that unexpected emotional responses always made her uncomfortable. She'd sat with it anyway. "You don't have to do this," Frances had said. "I know," Nell had said. "I'm doing it because it's useful. Don't make it into more than that." But Frances had made it into more than that, because Frances was a person who understood that the passage of knowledge from one woman to another in a place that was trying to kill you was not a small thing, even when the woman doing the passing refused to call it large. Word moved in the way that word moved in the territory, through wives who talked at the well, through hired hands who shared news over fences, through the particular information network that ran underneath the official one, and was, in many ways, more reliable. By summer, people in the valley knew that if you had a question about food storage or water management or land surveys or what your banknote actually meant when it said certain things in the fine print, you could ride out to the Ashby Ranch and ask. Nell didn't advertise this. She didn't call it anything. She just answered questions when people came with them, sitting at her table with her green notebook and whatever notebook the visitor had brought, and going through it with the same patience she'd applied to the Ashby accounts in the first week of May the previous year. She was not always gentle about it. She told a man named Croft, who came to her in August about his failing irrigation, that he'd made 3 avoidable mistakes, and she showed him which ones, and he left looking like he'd been dressed down by a school teacher, which Coulter witnessed from the field and found quietly satisfying. She told Frances Okafor's husband, when he asked her about a business arrangement another rancher had proposed, that it was structured to benefit the other party significantly more than it appeared to on the surface. And she explained exactly why, And he took the information away and came back a week later and said she'd been right, and he'd declined the arrangement and the other rancher had not taken it well. "Good," Nell had said. "That means you made the right decision." He said I'd been given bad advice by a woman who didn't understand business. "And yet here you are, with your money still in your pocket," she'd said. "Let him say what he wants." Coulter watched all of this from a particular angle that she didn't always see him watching from. The angle of a man who'd made a decision under pressure without knowing all the variables and had turned out to be right in ways that went considerably beyond what he'd hoped for. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected at best a capable partner who could manage the accounts and help him keep the ranch going. He'd hoped for someone he could live with without too much friction. He'd gotten those things, which were not nothing. What he hadn't expected was that the woman he'd refused to send back would become, over the course of a year and a half, the person in the valley that other people came to when they needed to understand something. He hadn't expected that the notebooks she kept, which had started as survival tools and had evolved into something closer to a record of the valley's collective experience, would become a resource that people referenced when they had disputes about boundaries or water rights or the proper method of calculating a fair seasonal wage. He hadn't expected to feel, at the end of a hard day, that the hardness of it was manageable in a way that it had not been manageable before. Not because the work was easier, because there was someone at the table at the end of it who knew what the day had cost and what it had produced and what tomorrow's priorities were, and who asked him sometimes how he was doing without making it into something he had to perform an answer for. She didn't ask him that often. She knew he wasn't a man who processed out loud. But when she asked, it meant something because it was specific. She wasn't asking in the abstract. She was asking because she'd noticed something in how he was moving or what he'd said at dinner, and she wanted to know what it actually was. He'd gotten better at answering. That was something he hadn't expected either. He thought about this sometimes while he was working, the way a year could change the shape of a person's life so thoroughly that the life before it started to feel not exactly unreal, but distant, like weather from a previous season. He'd been going under, this time 2 years ago. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, incremental way of a man who doesn't ask for help because he doesn't believe help exists, and who has been alone long enough that alone feels like the natural condition. He wasn't sure what he would have done if the stagecoach had brought the woman he'd pictured in the months of correspondence. Capable, uncomplicated, straightforwardly useful in the physical ways a ranch required. He thought he probably would have been grateful and functional and still, in some fundamental way, alone. He didn't say any of this to Nell. She'd find the sentiment excessive and the expression of it unnecessary. But he thought it, standing at the fence in the early morning or coming in from the upper pasture in the late afternoon, and he let himself think it because some truths don't require an audience. But the harvest that fall, the second full harvest season with Nell's planning behind it, was the best the ranch had produced in Coulter's time there. Not abundant, not the kind of surplus that creates wealth, but solid. The kind of harvest that meant the winter calculations worked out, that the numbers in the green notebook added up on the right side of the ledger, that next year they could think about the one thing they hadn't yet been able to afford to think about, which was expansion. Not expansion in the Cascade Land sense, not acquisition, not consolidation, not the swallowing of smaller things by larger ambitions. The other kind. One more acre under cultivation, one more animal added to the herd at the right point in the season. A water catchment system on the east side of the property that Nell had been sketching plans for since June, and which Coulter thought was probably achievable with 2 weeks of labor and the right materials. Small things. But small things, accumulated over time, were how you built something that lasted. Nell had understood this from the beginning. He'd understood it slower, because he'd come to the territory with the idea that you either found the big opportunity or you failed, and it had taken him longer than he'd like to admit to understand that there was a third option that most of the people around him had been quietly practicing all along. You built steadily, and you documented everything, and you protected what you had, and you helped your neighbors do the same. And after enough seasons of that, you looked up and realized you had something you could actually stand on. He'd needed her to teach him that. It bothered him occasionally that he'd needed it, that he'd been here 4 years without understanding something she'd arrived knowing. But it bothered him less than it would have bothered the man he'd been 2 years ago, who'd been running on pride in a way that pride couldn't sustain. Harlan Webb died in October, which nobody had expected despite his age, because he seemed like a man who had made a private arrangement with time and time was honoring it. He died in his sleep, which was how he would have chosen it if someone had given him a choice. And his sons came from wherever they'd scattered to and handled the property the way families handle properties when the person who'd held them together is gone, with a combination of grief and practicality that looked from the outside like callousness, but wasn't. The ranch went to the eldest son, who lived in Provo and had no intention of working it himself, and who put it on the market at a fair price within a month. The valley held its breath for a week, waiting to see who would buy it. Coulter and Nell talked about it for 3 evenings at the table, going through the numbers in a way that was honest about what they had and what they'd need and what the realistic outcome of overextending looked like if the next season was hard. They didn't talk about whether Webb would have wanted them to have it. That was sentiment, and sentiment didn't pay banknotes. They talked about whether it was financially sound. Nell's numbers said it was achievable with a specific set of conditions. The water catchment project delayed by 1 year. Ernesto brought on full-time rather than 2 days a week, a third cattle purchase timed to the spring market. Not comfortable, not safe, achievable. It's a risk, Coulter said on the 3rd evening. Everything here is a risk, she said. This is a bigger one. Yes, she said. She didn't argue it. They sat with it for a moment. What do you think? He said. Same question he'd asked her about the South 40, about the banknote, about a dozen things over 2 years. What do you think? Not what do the numbers say, though the numbers mattered. What do you think? She looked at the green notebook open on the table, and then she looked at him. I think Webb would have sold it to us if he'd had the chance, she said. Not because he owed us anything, because he knew we'd work it the way it should be worked. She paused. And I think we should buy it because it's the right piece of land in the right place at the right time, and we have the means to do it if we're careful. She looked at him directly. But I also think you should decide. It's your ranch. It was your ranch before it was ours, and you've been the one who stayed on it through 4 hard years. I'll tell you what I think, and I'll do the numbers any way you need them done. But this one should be yours. He looked at her across the table. It's been ours since the 2nd week of May last year, he said. Don't do that. She looked at the notebook again, almost smiled. Then we buy it, she said. They bought it. The winter of that 2nd year was long and honest about being long. No false thaws, no pretend warm days, just steady cold from November through March that asked you plainly to have prepared and rewarded you plainly if you had. The Ashby Ranch had prepared. The additional acreage of the Webb property gave them more winter grazing than they'd had, which mattered for the expanded herd, and the water catchment project, delayed by 1 year as planned, then built in late September with Ernesto and Louise and 2 days of Webb's youngest son's time, since he felt he owed something to the people who'd watched his father's back, held through the freeze and was waiting to collect whatever the spring thaw brought. Clara Birch married Ernesto Mendez in January, which nobody had predicted out loud, but most people had seen coming since October. The ceremony was at the Mendez house, performed by the same justice of the peace from Millhaven who'd married Nell and Coulter the previous winter, and this time there were guests, the whole Mendez family, the Okafor family, Aurelio, Torrance and his wife, Pruitt and Agnes. And Nell made the stew with the wild onions that she'd taught Agnes to make the previous spring, and Agnes brought bread, and the afternoon was loud and impractical and ran 2 hours longer than anyone had planned. On the way home in the dark, with the valley white around them and the horses knowing the road well enough to manage without much direction, Coulter said, "You didn't expect any of this." "No," Nell said, "when you got on the stagecoach in Pennsylvania." "No," she said, "I expected to work. I expected it to be hard. I expected it might work out, in the practical sense." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't expect the rest of it." "The rest of it," he said. "The people," she said. She stopped, started again. "You know when you've been somewhere long enough that you stop being a person from somewhere else and start being a person from here? I didn't know that could happen to me. I thought I was too much of the wrong kind of person for that to happen." "Wrong kind how?" She thought about how to answer. "The kind that people see first," she said, "before they see anything else. I was always going to be the large woman. I was always going to be that, before I was anything else. And I thought, I knew it mattered to people, and I thought there was no way around it except to go somewhere new and hope that what I could do would matter more than what I looked like. Eventually, she looked at the dark road ahead. I didn't think eventually would come this fast. He was quiet for a while. People see what they're looking for, he said finally. Pruitt looked for a liability. He found one because that's what he was looking for. I looked for someone who showed up anyway. He paused. I found that. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. What she thought about, in the weeks and months after, was the specific nature of the exchange they'd made. Not the legal exchange. Not the marriage contract, but the real one that had happened without ceremony sometime in that first hard summer. She'd given him her competence and her attention and the particular quality of her thinking. He'd given her the right to be seen differently than she'd ever been seen. Neither of them had named it as a transaction. Neither of them had kept score. That was the thing she hadn't learned in Pittsburgh, in the boarding house, in any of the places she'd passed through before the territory. She'd learned to protect herself by keeping accounts, by knowing exactly what she was owed and what she'd given, and by never letting the balance slip too far into someone else's favor. That was survival. That was what you did when the people around you were using you as a resource and calling it generosity. But this was different. She couldn't have explained the difference to her former self, the woman in the storage room filling out the agency form. That woman would have heard trust and thought risk, and she would not have been wrong. Trust was risk, fundamentally, and the risk was real. What she would have needed to hear, and couldn't have heard until she lived it, was that some risks were the only road to the thing you were actually trying to get to. That you could protect yourself so thoroughly that you protected yourself out of anything worth having. That the same caution that kept you from being used also kept you from being known. She'd been known here, not just known as competent, not just known as the woman with the notebooks who'd helped bring down a land fraud scheme. Known as herself. Difficult sometimes, inflexible about the things that mattered to her. Not soft, not easy, a person with edges. Known and not sent away because of the edges. She'd done the same for Coulter, she thought. Not softened him, but seen him. Seen that he was a man running on pride and stubbornness and a genuine love for the land he'd chosen that he didn't have the language to express. Seen that he wasn't reckless, just isolated. Seen that what he needed was not rescue, but witness. That was what she'd given him, and what he'd given back. Spring came on a Tuesday, which felt right. Nell was in the garden, expanded this year, 2 additional rows on the east side, the wild onion beds thriving, when she heard the stagecoach go past on the road below, heading north through the valley. She didn't stop what she was doing. She'd heard 100 stagecoaches go past on that road by now. They were just part of the sound of the territory, like the wind and the hawk calls and the cattle in the far pasture. But she looked up, briefly, old habit. The coach was full. She could see shapes through the windows, travelers heading somewhere, carrying what they'd managed to bring, hoping the destination would hold what they were looking for. Some of them probably had letters in their coat pockets describing places they'd never seen, written by people they hadn't met yet. Some of them were probably scared in the way you're scared when you've made a decision you can't take back. She looked at them for a moment and went back to the garden. She had her hands in the dirt, the familiar cold, warm resistance of spring soil that was ready to work. And she was thinking about the water catchment measurements she wanted to check before Coulter came down from the upper pasture. And the green notebook was on the porch step because she always kept it close. And the ranch behind her was making its morning sounds. Aurelio at the horses. Clara's voice somewhere near the house. The cattle in the near pasture. The barn solid in the morning light with its rebuilt roof and its straight walls. 2 years. It felt longer in the specific memories and shorter in the general shape of it, which was how time worked when it had been full. There were days she could barely remember individually. Hard days, boring days. Days when the legs hurt badly and the accounts were worrying and the territory felt indifferent in the grinding way it sometimes felt. And there were days that were clear as photographs. The stagecoach step, Coulter's face doing arithmetic, the fire orange against the dark, the lamp going down, Webb's hand steady on the water jug, the green notebook open on the table in the snow quiet of February. She was not the woman who'd stepped off that coach. Not thinner, not in the way that word usually gets used, not the kind of transformed that stories tell you about. She was healthier. Her legs were stronger, though they still had hard days. She still woke up sometimes in the night with the particular cold fear of the storage room in Pittsburgh, and it took a moment to locate herself. The sounds of the ranch, Coulter's breathing, the familiar dark of the main room where the cot was gone, and there was just the room, their room now, properly. She was still herself, still difficult about the things she was difficult about, still more comfortable with numbers than with sentiment, still most at ease when her hands were doing something useful. But she was here, she was from here. Whatever she'd been afraid of had happened. She'd arrived somewhere and been seen and not been sent away, and the world had not, as it turned out, ended because of it. That was the thing she would have told her former self, if that were possible. Not that it would be easy, not that the right man would see your worth immediately, not that the territory would welcome you. None of that was true. It would be hard, and people would be unkind, and the land would not care about you at all. But you could build something in it anyway, not in spite of who you were, but with who you were, with the specific, stubborn, record-keeping, pattern-reading, fence-observing person you happened to be. The parts of yourself you'd always been told were problems were the exact parts that mattered here. Your persistence, your refusal to simplify, your ability to sit with a hard number and not look away from it. What felt like a burden in the wrong place feels like a tool in the right one. She hadn't known she was in the wrong place until she landed in the right one. That was the part she hadn't been able to plan for. You couldn't plan for it. You just had to get on the stagecoach and go. She pressed a seed into the soil, covered it, moved to the next. Behind her, the ranch went on doing what it did, steady and imperfect and ongoing, and the territory spread in every direction as indifferent and beautiful as it had ever been. And the Tuesday morning light came across the valley the way it always did, without ceremony, without announcement, just arriving, just being there, just enough.